Well, it's just about 3 afternoon, so I'm going to go ahead and kick us off this morning, or noon, afternoon, I should say. Thank you so much for being here and for joining us for this really exciting virtual talk, The Mysterious World of the Garden Grotto. My name is Greer Luce. I am the Curator of Education and Public Programs here at Morven Museum and Garden. I'm very pleased to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Gerald and Margaret Hull, who are joining us to provide background and insight into a subject that's a bit of a mystery here at Morven, the Garden Grotto. We know through documentary research that Annis Boudinot Stockton designed and installed a grotto here at Morven in the late 1700s. However, evidence of the structure does not remain to this day. Today's talk will help illuminate the context and history behind Annis's lost grotto while taking us on a visual journey of incredible shell houses and garden grottos around the world. Before I share brief biographies for today's speakers, I did want to mention that we will not have time today for a full Q&A session. However, we highly encourage you to put your questions in either the Q&A or the chat box, as we're going to share those with our speakers, who are very happy to answer those questions directly via email. So please, throughout today's talk, feel free to type your questions into the chat or the Q&A box. So I'm now happy to introduce today's speakers. Gerald and Margaret Hull are lecturers who have taught in colleges and schools in London, Wales, and Ireland. Gerald, a Londoner, has a PhD from the University of Wales and is separately a published poet in Ireland and Cornwall. It was in Cornwall and the east of England where the couple moved in 2007 after buying an old church, and where they developed their interest in historical landscape gardening, grottos, and shell houses. Margaret has become an acknowledged expert on shell houses and shell decoration. She has met and documented every major artist and practitioner in the field. Now based in Bath, Gerald and Margaret have lectured extensively on this and related subjects in England, Wales, and Ireland, including at the National Trust, Stillington House, the BBC Bristol, Cheltenham, the Irish Georgian Society, Dorset Gardens Trust, and the St. Ives Literary Festival. The husband and wife duo tour the British Isles continually and increasingly have made visits to the Mediterranean, Italy, Germany, Austria, Spain, and the Channel Islands. They are currently working on a biography of Lady Joyce Gascoigne, a major shell artist associated with Bermuda, Devon, and the West Country. It is now my pleasure to hand things over to Dr. Gerald and Margaret Hull. Thank you so much for being here.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon from Bath, Somerset, England. Margaret and I have visited over 300 grottos, shell houses, and associated artifacts. Today we recognize these, natural or fabricated, in use for entertainment, as follies, as decorated conversation pieces, as places for study. Through 3 interconnected lectures and through our 3 publications, we would study the great British and European grottos and indicate how concepts here were carried to New England. The subject is interwoven with garden creation and landscaping, with shell houses, Wunderkammer, the work of artists and collectors of curiosities who displayed curios in grotto retreats. And America, a new world which sought to preserve the old, a wild frontier resisted, a terrain enclosed for control, idealization, away from a harsher, unshaped reality, nature as art. Our extensive European references provide the working context, for example, Henry Pratt's grotto at Lemon Hill, Philadelphia. This typically was Sedna bank, arched and decorated with shells.
The Anglo-Irish Mary Delaney created and decorated more grottos in the 18th century than any other woman, and is seen as a precursor to American detail at Morven. And indeed, Ashley Hall Shell House in South Carolina, which is detailed in our Zoom lecture on shell houses. Mary Delaney's Romanesque-style plunge pool can still be used today by guests staying at the Walton Bath House. We have visited twice and taken the plunge. Her rich shell work at Walton is especially impressive, a rare survival of 18th century shell festoons, which form the basis for my future book, Mary Delaney's World of Shells. Annis Boudinot Stockton is a seminal figure here. Thomas Jefferson regarded Annis's creative designs and collections in her shell grotto as definitive, as potentially, and I quote, a museum for the display of ancient relics. Like Richard Stockton, Jefferson would visit Twickenham and Alexander Pope's grotto on his visit to England when he toured with John Adams, the estates known to the Delaneys and the Duchess of Portland. He returned to America with artifacts from his travels, including a camera obscura. Alexander Pope, who died in 1744, had himself many curiosities. Basalt from the Giant's Causeway in Ireland, specimens from Devon and statuary of St. James of Compostela, seen here, and a stack of shell Belvedere.
In the early 20th century, the flamboyant Italianate grottos and statuary at Deerlings, Villa Betskaya, Florida, massively expanded such general private regard. This photo, Castello, Grotto of the Animals, such flamboyance here associated with the Duke of Tuscany, who was responsible for Florence's Bobbilite Gardens. It would have been universally recognized at the Villa Castello, for example, with its Grotto of the Animals and geometric shell ceiling, representing the magnanimity of Noah's flood. Certainly, the American poet Elizabeth Graham, visiting, counted Thomas Goldney and his underground shell grotto at Clifton, Bristol, as an influence as early as 1757. Noted the extraordinary grotesque shell decoration and sandstone lions. Later, 20th century expansion of collections of curiosities detailed in our lectures can be seen at DuPont's Winter Thurn, Delaware, at Stenton House, and the renowned shell grotto inside a shadow box there. And at the Shell Artist House, Bonnet House, Fort Lauderdale, which has similarities in context to the Parminter's 1790s à la Ronde in Devon. Charles Wilson Peale, writing to Jefferson from Belfield, Philadelphia, insisted, "Your garden must be a museum to you." His temple, firm or nay, and grotto beneath the summer house were contemporary to much of what was present in Britain at this period. So, two significant 18th century figures, Thomas Jefferson and Annis Boudinot Stockton. Now, Jefferson began his landscaping after taking control at Monticello in 1770. The house, Palladian neoclassical, His grotto had a Pope inscription, the floor and walls decorated with translucent pebbles from Hanover town and shells from Burwell's Ferry. He began artistic creation of his gardens. Like Pope in 1719, he was delighted to find a spring for his grotto. Of course, he visited England in this political capacity of his in 1786. He notified the modern style of natural gardening, which masked the hand of God as the hand of man. But himself, he preferred smaller estates and collections. Indeed, he visited the collections of Sir Ashton Lever at the London Museum, and Hans Sloane there, with his modern fascination with curios and science. Jefferson thought there was vanity in classical temples, pavilions, and faux ruins. There was. He was aware of private parks, whole valleys scooped out, landscape lakes, villages swept aside. We think of Stourhead, Bowood, and of course there was his own visit to Chatsworth. And he carried with him always Thomas Whiteley's On Modern Gardening, which afforded gardening a vital place among the liberal arts. April 6th that year saw him at Stowe, the most famous garden, praised by Pope and Rousseau, in ancient classical style with shell bridge, temple to Venus and Bacchus grottos, and a variety of stations in a landscape where water was key. His temple of Victory, honey-coloured Palladio, would feature in the design for Virginia's capital. He went as far as the ruined Leesows, the recent home to poet William Shenstone, who died in debt. Charles Hummerton was similarly ruined, having spent a fortune at Payne's Hill. Jefferson there admired the poetry and the Leesows, while lamenting grandiloquent Corinthian arches. April the 9th saw him at Pan's Hill. Indeed, while impressed with the large crystalline grotto, the Turkish tent, the lakes, castle, and the hermit's hut, he hoped the same fashion would not appear in America and bankrupt anyone. As a new American, Jefferson could look askance at the pompous, dated recreations of the old country. He'd been insulted by snobbery at court. He noted that in the New World, nature's done greater things on a nobler scale. Perhaps he had in mind the natural grottos of Shenandoah, Virginia. The fact that Jefferson visited Blenheim, Hagley Hall, Hampton Court, Chiswick, Ostley, and as mentioned, Derbyshire, Chatsworth, while also on critical official business, indicates his intensity of interest in garden subjects generally. Annis Stockton married Richard, a congressman in Morven. Her terraced garden was established in the 1760s, and Richard returned from England with antiquities, a piece of the King's coronation chair from that year, and more importantly, direction, very masculine, of course, following a special visit to Twickenham. She became a published poet of some standing. Her position, and I wonder did people call her the Duchess of Morven to her face, was essentially that of a bluestocking, as in the English circle at the time of Lady Coventry, Lady Hertford, and the Duchess of Portland, figures like Mary Delaney and Elizabeth Carter. And with the same enthusiasm for collecting, garden design, shell decoration, and poetry itself. Her poem, Ode to Solitude, is a nod to Gray, Thomson, and Anne of Winchelsea, with similar titles, inspired by private grottos and lonely paths. So let's enter that mysterious world of the Garden Grotto.
Grottomania in Britain, like tulip mania in the Netherlands, began from around 1720. A revolutionary change was happening to England's estate gardens. A new style of landscaping called the picturesque or naturalistic movement was sweeping aside the formal parterres. The grotto was to become the favourite garden retreat for many estate owners. The poet and writer Alexander Pope was a key figure in promoting the grotto as a significant feature in any garden redesign. His pastoral poetry used many edicts: first follow nature, consult the genius of the place, encouraging owners to use nature's natural topography in developing what would be informal gardens. Pope in 1719, with monies from his Homer translations, planned to create a Palladian-style villa and grotto overlooking the Thames at Twickenham, London. You can see the entrance to the grotto in this sketch on the left. A rare photograph taken around 1900 shows the villa with main entrance to the grotto tunnel that curved underneath the house and road, eventually leading to Pope's 5-acre garden. Notice the owner's passion for collecting statuary. This idea of building a retreat underneath or attached to the main house was a common feature in European villas from as early as the 16th century. This is the only 16th century grotto left in France, the Château de la Bastide d'Earth. It's located as an anteroom to the chapel, and it uses tufa stalactites, statuary, shallow ornamentation and a water feature. These decorative elements were adapted by estate owners in Britain. Grotto niches are here enhanced not only with these stalactites, but also classical statuary. And in Britain, very popular statues such as Neptune and Venus were popular choices in grottos. At the Château de Fontainebleau, the Pine Grotto is one of the earliest examples of an artificial grotto in France. Here we see an etching dated 1545 by Antonio Fantuzzi, and it shows the grand scale of the Pine Grotto with its monumental Atlantis columns. The design features 3 arches, and English grotto designs were to incorporate 3 areas within their structure. Alexander Pope's grotto has a tunnel and 2 main chambers. The 2 side chambers have statuary. The design features were also very important in that they were captured by William Searles, Pope's gardener. Here we have the magnificent Corsini Palace grotto room in Florence, also built underneath the main villa. And like Pope's retreat, Corsini was richly adorned with shells, statuary and curiosities. In this case, it was a subterranean theme. Goodness knows how this little hedgehog got in. The Palazzo Borromeo e Solibella on Lake Maggiore, again in Italy, is also a 17th century Baroque palace with grounds dominating the entire island. 6 grotto rooms are located underneath the main villa and include, as we see here, many cabinets of curiosities. Pope's grotto was his museum, where walls displayed specimens of unusual oars, spars. A piece of basalt from the Giant's Causeway in Ireland can be seen in the photograph in the lower left. He also incorporated into the walls many alabaster masks. Here we see the two side chambers on either side of the tunnel, which also displayed statuary. On the left is St James of Compostela. And we believe that after a visit to the Wookey Cave in Somerset, Pope had several stalactites shot down from the cave's roof. After his death, the villa was demolished, 1808, to stop tourists invading the garden. The grotto survived and today sits under Radnor Boys' School. We have visited on 3 occasions in order to photograph stages in its long-term restoration. Alexander Pope's much quoted art imitating nature was the mantra for many estate owners redesigning, or to use an 18th century term, improving their gardens. And one such garden is at Stour Head in Wiltshire, a natural style garden with winding paths, classically inspired eye catchers, and a magnificent artificial lake. This picturesque scene was designed by Henry Hoare, Henry the Magnificent, from the 1740s, and is one of England's earliest informal gardens. During his European travels, Hoare was influenced by Italy's classical statuary and buildings, and of particular importance for his garden was the Pantheon in Rome. The Stour Head Grotto is one of the earliest in Britain to have been built within a landscape garden, completely separate from the main house. Here we can see a rusticated exterior, set into a mound, near a water feature, and structured around 3 internal spaces. The main chamber indulges in recognisable classical statuary. Ariadne reclines above the cascades of a plunge pool. Henry Hoare used the reclining image, but added an English connection, an inscription, Ariadne, Nymph of the Grot, by Alexander Pope. Reclining Baroque statuary, associated with cascades, occurred in many of Europe's garden features. Italy and France were favoured destinations on the Grand Tour, and garden statuary was carefully scrutinised. Here at the Château de Vaux-le-Vicomte in the Ile-de-France, we see stone stairs and grotto niches, started around 1660. Notice the statue as Hercules, god of gardening, overlooking the water structure in the photograph on the left. This staircase is a World Heritage Site and was designed by André Lenotre. 2 grotto niches at either end contain reclining statues of river gods. At Palazzo Reale di Marlia in the Lucca area of Italy, on the border of the fish pool, are 2 statues of giants representing the River Arno, created in 1652. Croom Estate has a statue of Sabrina, goddess of the Severn. Etched out of code stone, the reclining statue overlooks an artificial lake by garden designer Capability Brown. This style of naturalised landscape, with a rusticated grotto, originally decorated with exotic shells, had a major impact on gardening across Europe towards the end of the 18th century, as we shall see. Neptune was a familiar maritime figure in Renaissance grottos, and at Stour Head he has his own cave. He is someone transmuted into a river god with a natural spring, where Henry Hoare was known to enjoy taking the plunge, and of course those panoramic views. Henry Flitcroft's rusticated design for the Stourhead Grotto used oolitic limestone, which resembles the tufa stone used on the facades of many European grottos. The grotto at the Villa Torrigiani was constructed from limestone tufa and located underneath the double set of steps in the walled garden. You can see that the grotto has the desired 3 entrances that lead into narrow winding tunnels lined with tufa rocks. The rusticated effect is mirrored in ceilings decorated as hanging rocks that represent stalactites. Wall niches contain statuary, some connected to water fountains, and a central chamber contains stone seating, open windows, and views of the garden, all characteristics of Stourhead. At this point, it would be well to consider Edmund Burke's definition of the sublime, very relevant to the grotto experience, where surprise, delight, and fear vie for our attention. Hence then, the subterranean cave effects, darkness, the eerie sound of water, and the transcendence into another ancient world, assisted by classical statuary, candles, strange shadows in tunnels, fueling wonder. One knows the school, the parkland, and its array of grand early 18th century features, but few take the secret Arcadian walk to see William Kent's grotto. You pass the famous Excedra, the British worthies, you cross the Shell Bridge with its pebbled seat, covered in detailed mosaics, and you finally reach a heavy, wooded landscape surrounding the imposing grotto. It was Lord Cobham's favourite feature. Its setting in the Elysian fields suggested the owner's utopian vision. He used the interior's plunge pool with its statue of Venus as a private spa, his own Arcadia. Milton's poem, referencing the goddess of the silver wave, provided inspiration for the grotto's setting. Like Stourhead, it is a shrine to the gods of water. The grotto had originally an interior decorated with shells and minerals. William Kent's design included this main chamber and 2 secondary chambers, that magical number again. At Stowe, a bathing Venus was a main focal point when in 1758 Lord Cobham gave a huge celebration to mark the end of the 7 Years' War. Lamps were hung inside the grotto, thousands attended, but only a small private group, that included George II, were invited into the grotto's main chamber to take a cold supper and swim with Venus. The highly influential Medici Grotto, Grotto Grande in the Boboli Gardens, inspired many decorative garden grottos with its combination of natural tufa rock, shells and caryatids. These reclining statues hold festoons of shells high above the grotto entrance. While its use of fake stalactites was to become one of the most popular internal features in creating a naturalistic cave effect. Giambologna's Bathing Venus is set back into the deepest grotto, centrally placed for greatest impact. The goddess would become one of the most popular statues associated with water features throughout Europe and Britain. One of Britain's most imposing subterranean grottos has to be the Shell Grotto at Goldney, created by Thomas Goldney. Here we see Bev Pike, Canadian artist, has captured its mysterious atmosphere in her epic painting, Buried Dance Pavilion, 2015. One entrance door with octafoil central window is in stark contrast to the exit tunnel composed of clinker from Thomas Goldney's ironworks. Goldney is unique. It is the only 18th century underground grotto in Britain to have internal shell decoration and a water cascade. Its long tunnel of furnace slag still has the power to shock and surprise the visitor. Internal decoration is linked to Anne Goldney, whose portrait is on the door and a date 1739 set in shells. We know that 18th century women particularly enjoyed collecting and embellishing garden retreats with shell patterns to impress their friends. Renowned grotto creator Mary Delaney visited in 1756, remarking, "Much the finest thing I ever saw, far beyond my expectation." Almost 200 years earlier, the Palazzo Reale de Marli a Lucca was built to entertain unsuspecting guests. And I would like to share some very interesting similarities and contrasts with Goldney. Both designs are located within a pleasure garden. The Italian grotto took 10 years to complete, Goldney over 30 years before the shell interior was finished. Both emphasise an element of unexpected surprise by contrasting the exterior with the interior. At Reale, the exterior is of pebble mosaics before you descend into the darkness of Pan's grotto. Both grottos have a circular main chamber made from a combination of hewn limestone with stalactites and grotesque shell imagery. Here at Reale, the grotesques are masks, gargoyles, statuary. At Goldney, the shell designs replicate mythological beasts centred around centipedes and macaws, which recreate a more sinister atmosphere. Neptune has been transmuted into a pastoral river god. Water spectacle plays an important part in both grottos. Both have water cascades, but at Reale, the emphasis is on hidden trick fountains emerging from statuary and the pebble floors. Pan, the god of revelry, underlines the fun element at Reale. And here at Goldney, a water cascade flows from the urn held by a river god who reclines within his own grotto at the source. A grotto niche houses a Bath stone lion and lioness. Animal statuary is rare in Britain's grottos, but at the Villa di Castello, Florence, we have one of the most famous and influential grottos in Europe. Cosimo I de' Medici, Duke of Tuscany, created a lower-walled garden, a fountain of Hercules, and the magnificent Grotto of the Animals, around 1538. This ornate one-roomed chamber displays 3 vast marble baths filled with wild animals sculptured from marble. The magnificent shell ceiling is decorated with geometric shell patterns and grotesque masks, so different to the animalistic symbols in Goldney's grotto walls, but so influential and inspiring for shell artists today. In contrast to Castello and Goldney, the interior ceilings of the Pine Grotto at the Château Fontainebleau in France contains delicate cameos of wildlife, swans, ducks and fish, all covered in shell patterns. Thousands of clam shells form a mosaic background. And these long rows of grotto rooms, hidden from the main palace, must have been an ideal place for a romantic rendezvous. William Champion was a relative of Thomas Goldney. He lived a few miles from the Goldney Grotto, and both men were owners of brass and iron factories, which was the main reason Champion began the Wormley Grotto in the 1740s. The byproducts of clinker and slag made excellent coverings in grotto tunnels. There is some evidence that both men visited Holland and Italy, which might explain this grotesque orcus in the main chamber. The hell mouth is reminiscent of the 16th century Park of Monsters. This spectacular feature, associated with life and death, is carved directly from the natural rocks within the park. William Champion continued the formal style of gardening he'd seen in Holland, and taking centre stage was a startling, if rather crude, conversation piece, a 30-foot statue of Neptune, today minus trident and an arm. Fashioned from furnace slag, he once stood on an island, but the artificial lake has long gone. Surely Bumazo again. I mean, this famous Park of Monsters is full of eccentric sculpture teasing the visitor to guess what each one might represent. Some represent Venus. Here we see Neptune, all carved out of surrounding rock. The symbolism of the garden, however, is yet to be understood. And here is a question. Perhaps Wormley's Neptune was influenced by the Apennino Colossus at the Villa Demidoff, near Florence. This spectacular 35-foot tall sculpture is also a building which can be entered. Inside is a network of grotto rooms, walls studded with shells and corals, pearls and crystals. One room even had a fireplace designed as a grotesque face which belched smoke out of its nostrils. It is well documented that the interior shell decoration in the Colossus influenced this 19th century grotto at the Villa Vizcaya in Miami. This little Venice on the shores of Vizcaya Bay was owned by James Dearling, who adored Italy. Notice the ceiling patterns use the same formal patterns as the Colossus, each section filled with coral stone and local shells from Florida. The outside of each grotto has carved statuary reminiscent of the Grotto Grande in Florence and the Château Fontainebleau in France. Returning to England, let's visit Scott's Grotto, a maze of underground tunnels created to test the many visitors' sense of geography, and it certainly tested ours when we visited in 2020. John Scott was a poet like Pope and Shadwell and used the grotto as a writer's retreat. The whole structure was restored superbly in the 1990s by the Ware Society to save the site from being developed. Here we have the main council room. Look at the unusual shell-lined seats. The shells included scallops, ormers, clams, cockles, oysters, many from Guernsey, and some conches. This octagonal summer house, reached by a steep path, is the only other original garden eye-catcher, and this cameo shows the panoramic views of the 18th century, now long gone. Scott's Grotto remained a popular entertainment project during the Victorian period, and as with Margate Grotto, another subterranean affair, the charge was 6d for a visit. Perhaps no other garden in England encapsulates the idealism of the French Rococo pleasure gardens as Paynes Hill. Charles Hamilton came to Paynes Hill, a derivation of Pan's Hill, in 1738. It experienced 2 grand tours of France and Italy. The landscaping included a range of ornamental stations or eye-catchers, built for no other purpose than to delight the imagination of the visitor. The Chinese Bridge, the Turkish Tent, the Temple to Bacchus, the Hermitage, and the rusticated grotto. The grotto was the central feature, built by master grotto builder Joseph Lane from the early 1760s. He chose the irregular limestone rock for its construction, perhaps because it bore similarities with European volcanic tufa rock. The Grotto Grande in Florence is an example which Hamilton had visited. The spectacular crystalline stalactites in the main chamber were a signature feature of Joseph Lane. Each one was moulded around a wooden inverted cone, nailed to the ceiling, plastered with lime water, to which the crystals were attached. Everything is artificial. Even the water element inside the grotto is fed by an Archimedes screw pump, in the past lovingly turned by the gardener. The Paynes Hill Restoration Programme has been awarded Grade 1 status, internationally recognised. Many artists, such as Bev Pike, has captured its unique atmosphere. It can be seen in her epic painting here, Cavernous Parlour. Britain's natural garden designs and Alexander Pope's mantra, art imitating nature, influenced European garden designs from the mid-18th century. So let's examine one sublime or wild landscape created by Marie Antoinette. The Petit Trianon is a chateau located in the grounds of the Palace of Versailles. Upon taking possession in 1774, Marie Antoinette set about remodelling the grounds in the English natural style that included 3 features: the grotto, a belvedere, and a love monument, all designed by her official architect Richard Miquet. To the left of the belvedere and a lake is this artificial hill named Snail Mountain, due to its steep winding paths, which lead to a hillside terrace and a man-made cave. A doorway, originally protected by a wooden trellis, leads into the grotto. Cloaked in shadow, the cave is lit only dimly by openings carved into the rock. A stone bench provides views of a waterfall and stream, and at the end of the grotto is a secret staircase leading upward to the hill's summit. A restoration programme in 2006 reinstated the artificial waterfall. It is believed that Marie Antoinette was at this tranquil retreat when warning of the mob reached her in 1789. How bittersweet.
Building grottos in Britain reached a climax towards the end of the 18th century. Interestingly, Horace Walpole of Strawberry Hill Villa, Twickenham, had predicted the demise of the grotto. Men tire of expense that is obvious to few. The ornament whose merit soonest fades is the hermitage or scene adapted for contemplation. It's almost comic to set aside a quarter of one's garden to be melancholy in. These words directed at that mercurial rival, William Beckford at Fonthill, Wiltshire, who moved from hermitage to grotto to secret tunnels, wilderness to grottos again, and finally to the building, disastrously, of his own never-to-be-completed abbey with collapsible spire. In time, the earlier frenzy abated. It would emerge 250 years later, as we shall see. Expense, fashion, or lack of interest played their part. Some became derelict or overgrown as the centuries moved on. For these reasons, we have photographed and recorded such disappearing features over the last 10 years with our latest publication, Shell Houses, Grottos and Shell Artists. Articles and a poetry collection have been happily forthcoming, and here's a poem I recently wrote, The Hall's Lost Grotto. These Stegosaurus clumps cover a court's bones from past winners of the Cesarewitch, handicaps at Epsom and Goodwood, while all the will in the world concentrated on a hermit as a trophy. A raw fountain entrapped in a stone pours a rill, running still from mews to shrubbery. How many hundreds of years alone now, the great house, half shuttered and gone, a baronet hunkered in the east wing, waiting for nothing but daylight's chance robbery of sleep and memory, no minuet to dance, no songs to sing. However, the 19th century did indeed see one major tile grotto whose origins are still a mystery. The Margate subterranean grotto, whose provenance is unknown. This famous architectural feature, stretching to over 105 feet long, is an enigma. Is it Britain's oldest subterranean grotto? Many rumours and theories are shrouded in mystery. Some believe this serpentine tunnel has shell patterns dating back to Phoenician times. That's about 500 years BC. They associate the symbolism of the turtle, the snake and scorpion panels with pagan images of birth. This turtle panel seems to have a sun symbol above its head. Artist Tracy Emin describes the rotunda, a circular feature with glass dome, as resembling religious Byzantine frescoes. In the altar chamber or catacomb, shell patterning uses precise geometric squares with motifs of sun and stars, beneath which are stone altar tables, perhaps suggesting rituals. Other theorists state the grotto from the early 19th century, when we are told it was accidentally discovered by children in 1835. It certainly was a major attraction during that Victorian period, where thousands of candle flames have tarnished shells to this pewter-like colouring. 4.5 million native shells still have that wow factor for grotto enthusiasts. Brilliantly depicted by artist Bev Pike here, the sunken seance meeting hall of some years back. Here's my poem, Margate Shell Grotto. And like a line of beads as far as the North Sea, Hellfire Club or Cretan, Phoenician, the soot from 1,000 candles in Victoria's time extinguished brightness. Now a pewter light leads you, quiet, into Pharaoh's tomb. A corridor of uncertainty, catacombed. What must kids have felt on first discovery? Couldn't keep it secret for sixpence. Smuggler's store with hack silver from some battle, hoard it, smash it for the metal. The walls seem foil and wrinkle, the scorpion and turtle. The limestone panel hidden in the hall, Gussie Calver, 1863, on a scallop shell. In 2020, during a trip to Dubrovnik, that's in Croatia, of course, we discovered the Neptune's Grotto, Trasteno, in the hills, hidden in one of Europe's oldest 15th century arboretum. The grotto was built in the 19th century as a Baroque nymphaeum, complete with Neptune, and with only a handful of tourists, we were able to experience a retreat with spectacular views of the great blue seas of the Adriatic. And this indeed concludes our 18th and 19th century survey, and we'll end with recent 21st century work of equal fascination.
Our continued fascination with building and decorating grottos is best illustrated by a number of 21st century projects such as Leeds Castle. We have met or are in contact with most of England's contemporary shell artists. A future lecture will focus in more detail on their dedication in both restoring historic features and creating new and inspired garden retreats. So I will conclude this lecture by highlighting the work of 6. The Millennium Grotto at Leeds Castle, Kent, encapsulates perfectly the 18th century experience of wonder and fear when descending into dark grotto chambers. But visitors must first have fun stumbling around a maze, and only when completed is the grotto entrance discovered. I love the interior decoration by shell artist Belinda Eade, and enjoyed hearing her stories of the challenges in decorating the ceiling while balancing on 30-foot high scaffolding. Imaginative Renaissance-style grotesque masks and classically inspired statuary by renowned sculptor Simon Verity adds to the atmosphere. It is a remarkable Millennium project that keeps grotto building alive and provides great family entertainment. We recently made a return visit to Belinda Eade's home in Milverton Court, Devon, to Somerset to photograph her latest projects, a rusticated grotto and shell pavilion. The grotto root house is built into a woodland bank where interior is lined with pine branches and natural curiosities such as pine cones. Here is Belinda's unique astrologically themed shell pavilion, and it incorporates her remarkable 3-dimensional birds within a symbolic tree of life. Blotker Wilson is an international shell artist working in Britain. Commissions range from restoring the shell work of historic garden buildings to designing her unique shell patterns in contemporary shell houses. At Belcombe Court in 2003, she created a wall maze, but chooses only 2 shell types. It's quite a spectacular achievement. One of her most difficult assignments was at Eaton Hall in 2000, home of the Duke of Westminster. The task was to create a grotto feature within the precinct of the family chapel. Blot informed me it was her most challenging project. The main problem was creating these stalactites at heights of over 40 feet. She also had to design an ornamental pond and walls covered with random shell patterns. But the result is one of the most spectacular grotto features in 21st century Britain. Here we have Candice Behuth, a professional designer who began her career creating tapestry, which provided the skills necessary for her shell embellishment of a grotto in Wiltshire. The blue, the yellow mosaics, and the iridescent shimmer from abalone shells reminds one of the Arabian 1001 Nights. Julian and Isabel Bannerman, the Grotto people, are the leading garden designers in Britain today. Their features have been included at Highgrove, Queen Elizabeth II Garden, and at the Chelsea Flower Show. And here at Woolbedding, the Bannerman design is evident in the wilderness, an area that includes a lake fed by the Little Rother River. The pathway from the lake was created and led to this hillside grotto. Inside the rusticated structure, the Bannermans created a small artificial pond with concentric flint rings filled with shells. And the fine statue of the Rother god's cloak is covered with Whitstable oyster shells. Isabel Bannerman developed her interest and skill in shell decoration while working at Uridge Manor from 1999 to around 2008. And the Grotto Room was inspired by Britain's oldest 17th century shell feature at Woburn Abbey. This Baroque feel is particularly noticeable in these photographs. Here we have the ceiling. Notice the rigid geometric patterns outlined with abalone and mussel shells. Here we have the frieze or cornice that creates popular 17th century marine symbols such as dolphins. And I'm told that the stalactites are mainly artificial. And here is one of my favourite features. This is actually the octopus frieze, very cleverly formed on each side of the wall, embellished with abalone, New Zealand pow shells and oysters. Very innovative. Ginny Otwell is a self-confessed magpie whose rich pickings from car boot sales have decorated 2 grottos at her home in Willsbridge. This is her first watery retreat, completed in 2009, built by her husband Mike. Ginny has decorated the walls with shells, ammonites, broken ceramics, all foraged from the car boot sales. She's even dyed old curtains, glue-sheened them with crushed mussels, and then moulded them into branches of wisteria, which you can see in the photograph on the right. This is the water cascade, which was created from a local stream, and for me, it just sums up the idea of a perfect retreat. Since 2012, Ginny and Mike have developed the disused mill near their home into a community centre where she teaches local children skills in shell artistry. They have reinvented the land around the old mill, planting thousands of wood anemone and native trees. Path leads to this fairy grotto. It's really built to house Ginny's thousands of curiosities. The shell mandala on the left sits in a formal garden with seating, and it's anticipated as a retreat for pupils and staff. So finally, I'd like to look at the professional artist Catherine Lloyd. She has a wide experience as a restorer and decorator, and one of her most important restoration projects to date was in 2017 at Pitts Hill House, Sussex. This late 18th century shell house was reputedly decorated by the 2 Mitford sisters. I particularly like these before and after photographs that Catherine has sent to me, because they show the challenging task involved. Close study of the decoration reveals not only the wonderful variety of shells, but also animal bones and pine cones. The whole restoration project at Pitts Hill received a major award from the Historic Houses Association. And this is the final grotto image. It's Catherine's recent hillside grotto, only completed this year. It's actually quite innovative in that it uses linear designs, very contemporary, that fills both the roof and the walls in geometric patterns, which would certainly be complemented by developing the surroundings into a formal garden. It's a very innovative creation that looks to a bright and a starry future in grotto design and decoration. All the shell artists and locations from this lecture can be seen in our latest publication, Conchinnelia Journey 2. Thank you very much.
Okay. Right, quite a lot there. I hope subtle links to such grottos as Monticello and Lemon Hill are evident. I couldn't help think that the grandiloquence of Florence's Villa Torrigiani was matched by that at Vizcaya in Florida, very similar. So Margaret and I hope to hear from you and with queries, observations, as we continue our studies and our travels. So our thanks to Grealus and to Morven for the opportunities offered here. Good afternoon, good evening from Bath, our home, a Georgian city with its own grottos in England. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. And I just wanted to say, for folks that weren't able to put their questions in the chat, you have my email as well. So feel free to email me any questions or observations that I can share with Gerald and Margaret. And thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful, I know it's your evening there, a wonderful rest of your evening. And that was really a fabulous talk. So thank you so much for being here today. And I will.
Thank you. Pleasure.
A great pleasure. Lovely. Thank
wonderful, you. Wonderful. Well, take care, everyone. And thank you again.